Hi, I'm Mike Fleming,
Yeah, and I'm Barb Chose.
and this is the Finding Healthy Church podcast. In this show, we talk about practical wisdom for life together. Specifically in church life, we are in the middle of a series of conversations about the nature and purpose of the church. Maybe we're towards the end of them. We've kind of been going at it and seeing where we'll end up. But in the last few episodes, we've been talking about how we think about the importance of church in our lives, like where it fits, how much of our identity is tied to it, what the scriptures communicate to us about it. And so in this episode, we're going to talk specifically about how important Jesus felt the church was in his followers' lives.
Do you know why? Did you ask yourself that question? Why do you try coming up with these inventions? Two worlds collide, but you can't combine the truth with all these lies.
So the backdrop of the first century Jewish family is very important to understand because in that culture, in the ancient Mediterranean culture, family was everything. It was your primary loyalty. Even spouses weren't considered family. And I think we talked about that
Right.
in a previous episode, that who you shared blood with was your family, and that's where your primary loyalty lied.
Right. It was always, and I think, in some ways that sort of has transcended down through history in one sense. I think there is still the importance of blood family, and when you're in-laws of a family, you have to try to figure out how you fit in, but you also know that you're not family,
Mhm. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, we talked about how the definition of whose primary families change, like in
Right.
our culture in America,
Oh, yeah.
we largely, once you get married, that's your new family.
Correct.
And that's where your primary allegiance lies. I know I've seen that in many testimonies of relationships between children and their parents and their in-laws and their brothers and sisters, etc. It's like your brother and sister kind of goes off and starts their own life. And you might be close to them, you might not be, but when it comes down to it, your primary loyalty is going to be to your spouse, where in a lot of cultures, including the ancient Mediterranean culture, that wasn't the case. People always kept primary loyalty to their blood family, their parents, their siblings, etc. And marriage was largely the social contract almost of, furthering the status and well-being of each family.
Right.
And that's why they got together. So, yeah, we talked about that at more length in a previous episode. But in this one, like I said, how important was the church to Jesus? And I want to start that conversation with something Jesus said about what he would do to families that was recorded in the Gospel of Matthew in chapter 10, verses 34 through 38. So he says this: "Don't assume that I came to bring peace on the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I came to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law." That's probably not too hard.
No.
A man's enemies will be the members of his own household. The person who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. The person who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever doesn't take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. And then he said something about his own family. And this was recorded in Mark chapter 3, verse 31 through 35. It says, "Then his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent word to him and called him. A crowd was sitting around him and told him, 'Look, your mother, your brothers, and your sisters are outside asking for you.' He replied to them, 'Who are my mother and my brothers?' And looking about at those who were sitting in a circle around him, he said, 'Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother.'" How do those verses hit you, Barb?
Well, I think in my early years as a Christian, you probably didn't think much about it. But I think as years have gone on, I realized the importance of what God intended by that, in terms of, when you look at, he didn't get his brothers around him when he started his ministry. He gathered a bunch of men and women that were not family and worked hard at helping them create a sense of family. They depended on each other. They took care of one another. And I think that's what he wanted. And that was his design, was to create family. Those who do the will of my Father is my brother and my sister and my mother. And, when you think about Jesus, when he was on the cross, one of the things he did, one of the last things he said was he looked down to his mother and he says, "Mother, here is your son." And then he was pointing to John, and he says to John, "John, here is your mother." So there's a sense even in that he was reminding them that family, his idea of family was much more than blood. And so I think it was also important that how we think about, who's going to rule in my life. And I think Jesus is saying, no, I'm going to be the one that you need to follow, and everybody else will come after that. But I think, he had a plan, and the way he lived it out was that's how everybody else would get loved as well, in the ways he wanted them to be loved.
So these statements by Jesus in the culture that he lived in, he's given sort of this picture or this precursor of what he thought about the church,
Yep.
right? And he's starting to tell his followers the importance of this new family he's creating. Mm-hmm. And here's the thing, it was utterly scandalous.
Yep.
And it was utterly dishonoring to Jesus' family in that culture.
It was almost, it was almost blasphemous, really, if you think about it,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, because of how they thought about family and loyalty to family.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, he's starting to give us a picture then of, we fast forward to today, and one of the buzzwords that gets thrown around is discipleship, right? A lot of churches will have in their vision statements or their mission statements something about making disciples, right? Mm-hmm. I know the church I attend, it's a real simple vision statement of "we make disciples who make disciples." That's the sort of the tagline, vision statement, whatever.
Where I come from is a little bit different. Yeah, we have, folks come around and they participate and they ask questions and they wonder, and we would say, well, if you would want to enter into a time of really learning about what it means to follow Jesus, then we would ask them if they would like to come under a period of time of discipleship where we would take them from wherever they're at. In other words, if they're not a believer, or if they are a believer and they're wondering about how they are needing to further their growth in the Lord, and we take them through, we tell them, well, this is what it might look like over the next year. We just want you to give you a year of trying to figure these things out, and we'll walk alongside you to help you figure that out. But you're going to learn about Jesus and what the call on your life is if you decide to follow him, because that's what it means to be a disciple, is to be a follower of Jesus. And so it's trying to teach people what that means. And
he's given us a little nugget, right here, where he's saying, like going back to what I was saying about churches. saying stuff about discipleship, the question then becomes, well, what is discipleship really?
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus is giving us a picture of this. And the thing is, it includes this conflict, or it doesn't have to be conflict, right? Because we see Christians and their families get saved, and et cetera. We see that all over the New Testament. So it doesn't have to be, but there's this, Jesus is giving us a sense that discipleship has to do with becoming part of a different family, right? Of this choice,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Between our natural families and our spiritual family, if it comes down to that. Now we pray and we hope that it wouldn't come down to that. But he's clearly saying, like, there's a choice that a lot of people will go through that's getting down deeper into how he views the church, and then how his followers should then view the church.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think we see discipleship in our culture. What I've observed is that the definition of discipleship, if you ask like the average Christian where we live, it's like, what do you do to do discipleship? In fact, at our church, we have things called discipleship groups. And what they do in those groups is they read the Bible together, they pray together, they talk about their issues and their problems, and they help each other. Okay, so that's a level of discipleship.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people see it as just, how do you grow spiritually? How do you be a disciple? Well, I read the Bible, I pray, and I go to church. Right? That's sort of like the Holy Trinity of discipleship.
Right.
And we can see here there's a contrast here between that Holy Trinity of discipleship and sort of the picture Jesus is painting about how he thinks about the church, how he thinks about discipleship within the church. And it's a deeper calling that he's communicating here, that there's a real seriousness to it that goes beyond just sort of these routine spiritual disciplines we might partake of on a regular basis.
Right there, it's like almost like, so what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about the things you read? What are you going to do about the things you pray for? What do you think going to do with those things? How your vertical relationship with God needs to be fleshed out in a horizontal relationship with God. Obviously, 1 John says, how can you love me, whom you haven't seen, if you don't love your brother whom you have seen? So there's definitely a call that there has to be a horizontal fleshing out of our relationship with God. And so it is, what does that look like? And how serious is that? And is it just something you can just choose, or is that something you must do out of obedience to your relationship?
Yeah. And this gospel, that Jesus is starting to unpack with his followers about talking about a new family, talking about a transfer of loyalty, it feels a little bit different than, what we typically hear in our culture. Like, you go get a gospel message or you listen to a gospel message, very rarely will that person say something like this, right? Because even in our culture, right, like our priority order is typically, right, God, family, sports, do good in school, church, right? Like,
right.
Like, yeah, that's just the reality of it. Like, church is sort of this thing you do because you're a Christian, you go to it and you do it.
It's an option, though. For a lot of people, it's an option. I mean, I know of people who basically believe, oh, no, I have a relationship with God. I don't really feel like I have to do church.
Yeah.
Be to church.
And, I'm not even saying there's a lot of blame in that, because
Absolutely.
Would I give my primary loyalty to my church that I attend right now as opposed to my family? Absolutely not. And you'd be like, well, Mike, are you not practicing what you're talking about right now, what Jesus is saying? No, I think Jesus was talking about a different community than the one I'm a part of. The
Yep.
one I'm a part of doesn't have that kind of commitment to each other. And so it would be unwise for me to give primary loyalty to a community that wasn't highly committed to each other, under a gospel that was as powerful as the one of Christ and the apostles. It would just be unwise for me to give that primary loyalty there because of the weakness of the community that I was giving that loyalty to, right?
Right. Well, you have to understand and work through the relationships and come together to make a commitment together, to live like that. It's almost like unto getting married in one sense. You make a commitment to your spouse. And why not, have something similar in the kind of the practical sense of understanding what it means to be family, And I, differently than you, obviously, have been part of something like that for 50 some years.
Mm-hmm.
And there's still the dilemmas that go on. There's still the issues that happen. There's still, self gets in the way, of that. And you win some and you lose some and stuff. But for us, we all started off that way. We started off, we wrote up a statement of commitment together. We all agreed to it together. And our attempt was to live it out together. And we, made promises.
Mm-hmm.
And it's tough, just like in a lot of ways, it's like when a married couple decides when there's a divorce, it's painful. And so we've had those situations happen in our congregation as well, where people will have disagreements that we can't reconcile. And then, things happen and then there's that gets broken. But do you just say, well, it didn't work, and so you go back to a situation where you're not hurt, or you don't have to take care of others, or you get to decide what you want? Or do you say, well, but what did Jesus want? And he still wants, I think, his disciples to live in those kinds of relationships. I think that's why the letters are there. I think that's why Paul and Peter and John and James continue to, in their letters to the churches, there was tough times. They'd never lived like that before. And all of those letters were about how to keep it going.
Yeah, keeping on despite the challenges of what Jesus is talking about here is like, you're transferring your loyalty to this new family.
Yes.
With all the mess that comes with that.
Yep.
But that was his gospel. That was his desire. There's this thing called domesticating the tradition. This is a concept I've read about that is basically the tendency or the practice to take something that happened in one context and make it fit into yours by changing it, right? You change, because like you always have to change maybe expressions of something or like how things are done according to, your context. But domesticating the tradition actually changes the heart of the thing, right?
Right.
And I think discipleship and this whole idea of the importance of the church and what church is one of those things that's been domesticated to fit into, and we've talked about individualism a lot, so we won't dive into that, but just to touch on it, individualism has domesticated what Jesus is expressing here, the importance of the church, what it is, the level of commitment to it, the loyalty to it. And it's made its way really into even our theology. It makes our theology focus on certain things and not other things. So even if you take a look at like creeds, if you go read the average doctrinal statement of a church, they will focus on who Jesus was. They want to make it clear that, Jesus is the Son of God. what he did for us, his death and resurrection, and things like that. But there's very little focus on what Jesus was like, and what his followers should be like. So you won't, go read a doctrinal statement or a creed, and it won't say, he was God, and then he showed us what God was like, and it was like this, and his followers are supposed to do this and this and this, right?
Right.
And so largely these doctrinal statements focus on beliefs and very little on this kind of practice and lifestyle that Jesus is getting at. They ignore, mostly how Jesus treated people. They ignore how he related to his family. They ignore how he related to the socio-cultural institutions of his day.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they don't address any of that stuff.
Right.
But the Gospels do, right? The New Testament does. But we kind of leave those out of those things, what we adhere to. Or even when you go, become a member at a church, it's like, do you believe in these 10 bullet points of who God is, who Jesus was, what we believe about God?
Right.
And there's nothing about this kind of stuff where it's like, well, here's what we think about discipleship. And that's actually what Jesus said about exchanging your loyalty from any person or group of people to his church and his mission.
Right.
We don't really get into that.
Right. It's like, okay, so you believe all these things now, so what? So what is that? What effect does that do? If you say you believe, then you've got to open it up to say, oh, if I believe, then I've got to, and the scriptures talk about living by faith. And it's like, well, then what does that look like?
If you believe, you will exchange one family for another.
Exactly.
That was at the heart of what it meant for Jesus to have a disciple.
Right. Because
like even in Luke 14:26, he says this: if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Like, that's like pretty straightforward. I mean, the word hate there is probably a bad English word. It doesn't mean like I hate my father and mother. It probably means something about loyalty and, what's the priority in one's life.
Yeah, what it means is it's not as important. It's not the most important relationship. So if you come and you love basically what you're saying, and you love your father and mother more than me, your own life, your brother more, then you can't be my disciple. And he's not saying, he's not the one that's making the judgment, but he's saying, then by the nature of what I am calling you to do, to be my disciple, you aren't going to live it. That's not, and so it's basically, he's not punishing you. He's just saying, okay, you're out, kind of a thing. He's not saying that. I think what he's saying is, don't you get it? If you come to me and you say you believe, then this is what it's going to look like. It's going to look like your father and your mother, your wife, your children, your brother are not going to get first picks from you. Mm-hmm. Me first, then they come after. How you care for them comes after. But the other thing I think people forget is, if you love God and you love Jesus, you'll automatically be caring for your family, your blood family, in a way that would honor God.
Yep. He was not saying that you needed to categorically sever your relationship with your family. It wasn't a choose between two families. It was a shifting of a loyalty.
Yep.
Right. Where does your primary loyalty and primary focus lie? But it doesn't mean you leave your family behind. No. I don't want anybody to go away from this conversation thinking we said that, because we're not saying that.
No, and I think one of the things I would want to define is the word believe. And I think, we think, oh, I just have to believe it. No, the word believe, when you break it down to its roots, it's saying by life. And so what that means is if you believe that there's a chair in the room, and I say, Mike, do you believe there's a chair in the room? And you can say, yeah, I believe it. And I say, well, show me that you believe it. Well, what you would do is you would go over there and you would sit in that chair.
Mm-hmm.
And that way I can say, yep, you're right. You believe it because you believed that chair was a chair. And so you sat in it to prove to me that it was a chair. If you just said to me, oh yeah, I believe it, that might be, maybe you do, maybe you don't. I can't tell by your life.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we have to remind people, we've sort of minimized the definition of the word believe. And usually to realize that word means by life. So by my life, you can tell.
Yeah. If we, I guess if Jesus looked at us and said, do you believe? And the criteria was like our commitment to his community.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it would be, I don't know. It would be pretty wanting. It feels like pretty weak. At least where I'm at for the most part. And I'm not saying everybody, I don't know. I can't judge everybody's personal situation. But it's just been my observation, I think we talked about maybe a couple episodes ago, how like the church I attend is tripled in attendance but the Christians in our city, the number of those hasn't gone up. So it's basically Christians jumping from one community to another community. Mm-hmm. And I'm in that boat too. Like I've done that. So yeah, there's this real issue of like the challenge or the dilemma of a group of people finding each other and having a gospel that's powerful enough for them to give each other primary loyalty and work through the issues they need to work through so that they can do life together and make the kingdom of God visible through that process. And I think it's something that you've attempted with a good amount of success comparatively to maybe myself or others, in all the years you've been attempting to make that happen.
Yeah. I mean, there has been, there are issues with, obviously when family, especially blood family, doesn't understand, Yeah. And so there's always this vying for who gets the primary allegiance, Mm-hmm. And when you live out your life saying that Jesus gets primary allegiance, it can be very difficult, and I've experienced that, Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But I think one of the things that was kind of remarkable later in the years that we're part of this congregation and how we were living out our life, my parents would never come and stay with us because, they never felt like our house was just ours in one sense, But I know we had a situation and I had a surgery. So my mom came and she was kind of helping out and she saw how I was being cared for, and taken care of. And one of the words she said to me, this was after like 10 years of being a part of this congregation, she says, I can see that you really have family here. And that was, even though they didn't necessarily agree with how I was living in my life, she was able to see that. And I know that was something she really longed for, that she never got in one sense, where Jesus says, if you do this, then you'll get, I think, and things you're going to get 100 times, what you have. But so I think those can be tough times, how people misunderstand or don't agree, and yet they can see from the outside what is, going on.
Yeah.
So.
Well, that's a great example and testimony of just your personal experience of just like, it doesn't have to be like, I know Jesus' words are very extreme when he's talking here in these verses, but it can be in ways like you're talking about where it's just like maybe there's a disapproval, right? Maybe the relationship's not severed, but there's this underlying tension because the choice you made to commit to and go all in with this group of people that believes in Jesus,
right? And
created it.
Yeah, and not even necessarily not caring for my parents or my family.
Mm-hmm.
It was just there was a competition that I didn't necessarily want or choose into, but I just lived my life based upon what I believed, and I also cared for my parents in ways that I could. But the bottom line was they were not top dog, and that became kind of an issue for them.
Yeah. Yeah, it certainly creates a dilemma. I want to read a quote from a book called When the Church Was a Family, and it talks about this dilemma. It says, for Jesus to organize his followers as a strong group family presented a potentially intractable dilemma. The early Christians suddenly found themselves with not one, but two families demanding primary loyalty and commitment. Mm-hmm. Their natural families and their new surrogate family of brothers and sisters in Christ. Jesus radically challenged his disciples to disavow primary loyalty to their natural families in order to join the new surrogate family of siblings he was establishing, the family of God. A person simply could not express equal allegiance to two families in the social world of Jesus and the early Christians. Those who joined the family of God that Jesus was gathering around him had to wrestle with their ongoing commitment to their natural families. When a conflict of loyalty occurred, a follower of Jesus aligned himself with his church family as his primary locus of relational solidarity. Whenever possible, Jesus encouraged ongoing loyalty to natural family relations on the part of his followers. The natural family existed to serve the designs of the family of God and not vice versa. Mm-hmm. The focus was on the church, not on the family. Right. And where conflict between the natural family and God's family did arise, the faith family was to become the primary locus of relational solidarity.
Yep. There you have it.
Yeah. And that caused Peter to go to Jesus and say, you remember when he said, look, Jesus, we have left everything and followed you. And Jesus had the response that you brought up just before I read that quote, which he said, I assure you, there is no one who has left house, brothers and sisters, mother or father, children or fields because of me and the gospel, who will not receive 100 times more now at this time, and eternal life in the age to come. Mm-hmm. So Jesus was assuring Peter that if he joined up with some other people who treated the church like a family and gave their primary allegiance to that family, he would find true life in the kingdom.
Yeah, I have another quick story about that, and that is my husband and I were not able to have children naturally. We did get to adopt a child at birth when she was first born. But prior to that, I had these years of longing to be a mom and couldn't do that and wasn't able to do that. But because I was we were part of a congregation like we were, one of the things I was able to realize was how God was providing children. There were several families in our congregation, and they all had children, and their parents, who were my companions, my partners in the Lord, they had no issue with me being their kid's second mom. And now these kids are in their 40s, and they still refer to me as their Chinese mama. Because I was part of their life growing up. I went to their soccer games, took care of them, watched their kids, and now the grandma of their kids. So I would not have had that. I just would not have had that. And I realized that, you know, even if we hadn't adopted our daughter, didn't have that opportunity, that I was really able to spell life in capital letters because the Lord provided.
Mm.
And I think if I wasn't part of a congregation like that, I would not have had that particular scripture fleshed out, you know. And so I use that a lot of times as testimony to folks.
That's great. Yeah, thanks for sharing. That's really cool. Okay, wrapping up. So what is healthy for a church? It's to have the same view of what a church is and how important it is that Jesus did, right? The typical American individualist evangelical, as we talked about, has a set of relational priorities that typically goes like God, then family, then church, or sports, and then church, or, whatever. Or, accomplishments and then church. But in a healthy church, in order for a church to be healthy, you got to have a group of people where they see that there's no distinction between commitment to God and commitment to his family. Mm-hmm. That loyalty lies with God's family just as much as it relies with God, or as it lies with God, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right, we'll leave it there.
Okay.
If you want to contact us with any questions or comments, feel free to email Mike, Mike, at findinghealthychurch.com. And we have a newsletter you can subscribe to at findinghealthychurch.com if you want to get regular updates about when we have new stuff that comes out.
Why did you ask yourself that question? Why do you try coming up with these inventions? Do you know